We all know the story of the crazy dude who ran from Marathon to Athens to deliver the news that the Greeks had won the war and then died of exhaustion after delivering the news. Turns out, this story isn't entirely accurate. Our hero, Pheidippides, wasn't crazy enough to run the distance from Marathon to Athens. No, not at all. In fact, he was way crazier. Let's take this from the top and go through the whole story. We'll have to start at the beginning first. Why was there a war in the first place? Well, the Greek city-states of Athens and Eretria angered the Persians by sending troops to support the anti-Persian uprisings in Ionia, a part of modern-day Turkey. The Persians decided to crush the supporters of the rebels. This was the Battle of Marathon. The Battle of Marathon had one of the largest maritime transport of warriors in history. This was the nearly 60,000 strong army of the Persians. Well, considering that we know that the Greeks won, there must have been an even larger home team facing this incoming army, right? Nope. The Greeks had an army of barely 10,000 men. This included the Athenian army as well as reinforcements from Plataea. Realizing that they were severely overwhelmed by the enemy forces, the Athenians realized they needed support from the legendary Spartans. Just one teensy-tiny problem. Sparta was about 240 kilometers from Marathon. Well, the Athenians didn't have horses to spare, so instead, they decided to send one of their daytime runners. You guessed it, our hero, Pheidippides. This guy ran till Sparta, a distance of about 150 miles, in under 2 days to plead with the Spartans for aid. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how incredible a feat of athleticism this is. Let's take a modern day 150-mile ultramarathon. The Atacama Crossing Ultra is a 155-mile ultra scheduled to take place over 7 days. Pheidippides ran the same distance in 2. Well, exhausted as he must have been from the journey, his job was not complete. He needed to present a compelling case for why the Spartans should join the Athenians in battle. Men of Sparta, he reportedly said, the Athenians beseech you to hasten to their aid and not allow that state, which is the most ancient in all of Greece, to be enslaved by the barbarians. Apparently his plea was convincing, for it worked. But the moon wasn't full, and religious law forbade the Spartans to battle until it was, which wouldn't be for another 6 days' time, by when it would be much too late. Pheidippides had to let his people know about the delay, so he did the unthinkable. After a brief catnap and some food, he awoke before sunrise and set out on the return trip, all 150 miles back to Athens. On the return trip, he comes across the Greek god Pan. You see, Pan was angry at the Greeks since they didn't have any temples of him. He told Pheidippides to go back to his army and tell them that he, Pan, would play such a tune on his pipes that would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. This feeling of fear nowadays is referred to as panic. Well, we can never know whether or not Pan actually played a tune on his pipes. But oddly enough, the Persian cavalry was not at Marathon. Mystery surrounds the whereabouts of the Persian cavalry, a force that was crucial to the empire's military tactics on the day of the battle. Some believe they were away gathering supplies from nearby villages. Others believe that they were still at the Persian camp, not yet ready for battle. Some others suggest that they had already been boarded onto ships destined to attack Athens. Well, whatever the reason, it seems more than likely that the cavalry was split off from the Persian army that morning. After getting this information, to meet the larger invading force, the Athenian commander Miltiades thinned out his army's center and reinforced the wings, hoping that his hoplites, heavily armed foot soldiers, could hold the middle while his flanks broke through the lighter clad Persian infantry. In fact, the Athenian center did break, but it held off long enough for the Athenians to reroute the Persian wings and meet in the rear, causing a general panic among the invaders. The Battle of Marathon remains one of the most important military clashes in history. Not only did its result signal the beginning of the golden age of Greece, but it was also a key moment in the rise of Western civilization and one of its most espoused values, democracy. The Battle of Marathon was not just about two armies opposing each other, it was about a lot more. It showed two worlds representing two entirely different systems of values. No doubt, our world would have been different today if, in that battle, the power of might had prevailed instead of the values of democracy. The victory of the Greeks in the Persian Wars resulted in the survival and development of a newborn political system, that of democracy. It highlighted to its supporters that the values of the democratic world, at the core of which is the individual, eventually prevails over those rammed down with a heavy fist. The Athenians lost 192 men at Marathon, mostly, we can presume, in the weakened Athenian center. Their burial mound, known as Soros, is still visible to this day on the plain of Marathon. As for the Persians, their 6,000 dead were left unburied, a visual spectacle for any wishing to know what the Easterners looked like. In honor of Pheidippides' feat, it was decided to add a new sport to the Olympics. This sport was named the marathon, after the plain where the battle took place. Contrary to popular belief, the distance was not set as the distance of the marathon was not set as the distance between Marathon and Athens. Rather, it was based on the distance from Windsor Castle to London's Olympic Stadium, the route of the 1908 marathon. This distance, as we now know, is 42.2 kilometers. Fun factoid for all of you who would never have known what the distance between Windsor Castle and London's Olympic Stadium would have been. Well, some folks who wanted to truly recognize the greatness of Pheidippides' feat, get it? Decided to hold an ultramarathon along the route that he would have taken to get to the Spartans, 240 kilometers from Athens to Sparta. This is the Spartathlon Ultra, held every September. Some people decided to take this a step further and started the authentic Pheidippides run. This ultra goes along the entire distance that Pheidippides would have run. This ultra goes from Athens to Sparta, back to Athens, from Athens to Marathon, and then finally from Marathon to Athens, carrying news of victory. Rejoice, we conquer, cried Pheidippides before he collapsed of exhaustion and died on the spot. He had done what no one had done before in recorded history, run nearly 600 kilometers in the span of about 4 days.
Government, castle, chambers. What do you think these three words have in common? All these three words are actually of French origin. As a matter of fact, 45% of all words in English are having French origins. In order to understand why this is the case, we need to look at a particular event in history, which is known as the Battle of Hastings. In order to understand why this particular event had such impact on the language of English, England, and the world at large, we need to know a little bit of backstory. So let's go back to the 800s, where There was a power struggle between two major factions: the Anglo-Saxons, the primary rulers of England, and the Vikings. There was a constant power struggle between these two factions, which is why the throne was sometimes under the rule of the Anglo-Saxons, sometimes under Vikings. It was very unstable. Because of this, the Anglo-Saxons sent their royal family to take refuge south of England in a place known as Normandy. Eventually, the dust settled in England and the Vikings took over. They ruled for a fair bit of time, but the last Viking king did not have any heir. And this is when member of the royal Anglo-Saxon family, Edward, decided I should be king. Edward, along with the Earl of Wessex Godwin, took control of England. Edward married Godwin's daughter, and now he became the king of England. But Edward never had any kids, which was strange for a king back in those days, because now you don't have any heir. What was even more strange was that he was extremely close to his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson. They both were so close, some people say that Harold was almost co-king. Eventually, Edward was on his deathbed, and Harold naturally assumed I should be the next king. But things weren't so simple. There was one problem, and that problem was William the Bastard. Edward had a lot of friends in Normandy, one of them being the Duke of Normandy, William. Edward was very pal with this guy, and what he told William was, when I die, you can take the throne of England. So now you have two people who are now contending for the throne. Eventually, Edward died and Harold took up the throne. William did not like this one bit. He started preparing a fleet and he decided to invade England from the south. But he couldn't do this just yet. There was one thing that was stopping him, and that was the wind. The wind was blowing in the opposite direction, from north to south. Because of this, he stayed put. He decided to wait. He waited for 3 days, eventually 3 weeks. Now he started to get impatient. He took a ship and decided to invade anyways. Not so surprisingly, his ships got thrashed and he washed ashore on Normandy. He decided to stay put now as he finally learnt his place. Meanwhile, while all this waiting was going on, Harold knew there was an invasion coming from the south. He concentrated his army towards the south and was waiting for the attack. While this waiting was going on, there was an unknown challenger. He was the king of Norway. I won't try and spell his name because I know I'm going to get it wrong, but it's written here anyways. And why was he here all of a sudden? Back when one of the Vikings were ruling England, he promised the king of Norway England after he died. So now there are three people who are claiming the throne, which meant things were really going to go bad. The same wind that was blocking William from invading from the south allowed the king of Norway to reach the north of England. As soon as he reached the north, Harold was alarmed. He gathered all his troops and within 4 to 5 days marched up north. He finally met the Norwegian king in what came to be known as the Battle of Stamford Bridge. You see this bridge? There was a Viking berserker who held that bridge and killed almost 40 Anglo-Saxon soldiers. Eventually, though, the Anglo-Saxons overpowered, and thus the final Norwegian invasion came to an end. After this long, hard-fought battle, Harold was tired. His troops were tired. They needed some rest, but life was not willing to give him any. As soon as he won that battle, the wind changed its direction, and before you knew it, within the blink of an eye, William was at a place called Hastings in the south. Harold once again gathered his army, rushed to the south, and encountered William in this battle. Harold commanded his troops to assume the formation of a shield wall on a hill. He took a defensive position because he really couldn't afford to attack William now. William, however, decided to break the shield wall using various tactics. He first used arrows. They weakened the wall, but he just couldn't budge through. Then he started using different combinations of infantry and cavalry, but just nothing was happening. So he tried a different approach. We don't know exactly if he did this deliberately or not, but William commanded a few of his soldiers to attack the shield wall. And then suddenly, he told them to retreat. While they were retreating, Harold's men thought that they were getting victory. Overconfident, they started chasing after William's men and they broke the shield wall. After they broke their formation, William commanded his troops to isolate Harold's men into small pockets and nullify their forces. During this exchange, Harold got an arrow in his eye and he lost his life. And now, William the Bastard became William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England. During William's reign of England, England had massive changes. There were a lot of churches, cathedrals, and castles that were built. The language had the most change. The old Anglo-Saxon English was now romanticized. A lot of the noblemen living in England now are Normans. As a matter of fact, the Anglo-Saxons who were peasants used to speak the old dialect, but the Normans, the noblemen, used to speak the new English. As a result of this, few words like when, where, and what now became when, where, and what. Because there was a division in class between which class to use what language. Words like this are censored even today. If I say this word, probably YouTube will demonetize this live stream. But if I say the word defecate, I'm completely fine. Another peculiar thing to notice is the Normans recognize the alphabet A as O. So you can thank them that you don't live in a ham, but live in a hoe.
The Normandy landings were a coordinated landing and airborne operation that launched the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Soldiers from 12 nations participated, major players being America, Britain, and Canada. The invasion was codenamed Operation Neptune, arguably the most important event in modern history. 500,000 men were stationed throughout England, preparing to cross the English Channel, strike the Normandy coastline of France, catch the Germans off guard, and win the war. I'm not saying that the Germans didn't know an invasion was coming. They knew. There was no hiding that because of the scale of the operation. However, they were clueless as to when the attack would happen, where it would happen, and how many troops would attack. And the Allies wanted to keep it that way. Operation Fortitude was the code name for the deception strategy the Allied troops used to mislead the Germans. There were two possible locations available to the Allies, the Pas de Calais and the Normandy coastline. Calais would have been the closer, more accessible, more obvious location to launch the assault. Precisely why it wasn't chosen. The Allies went ahead with plans to storm Normandy, while the British intelligence agency, MI5, kept feeding the Germans misinformation. Fake armies were stationed opposite Pas de Calais. The film industry was called in to create entire fake armies, complete with wooden aircrafts and inflated army tanks, like the one you see on your screen, while the real troops and tanks were preparing for the real assault. At one point, the king, King George VI, even made an official inspection visit, and this was broadcasted all over the world. When the British mathematician Alan Turing's team managed to decrypt the German encryption system, Enigma, the Allies were able to confirm that the deception was working. The 50-mile target coastline was divided into 5 sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, between the US, UK, and Canada. After months of extensive planning, the day finally arrived. A lot went down on this day. Some went right, some went wrong. June 6, 1944. This was the day, this was D-Day. The weather on D-Day was far from ideal. The operation had to be delayed by 24 hours. A further postponement would have meant a delay of 2 more weeks. That would be enough time for the Germans to figure out their plan and prepare for it. It was hence decided that the risk was to be taken and the assault was to be carried out. 60,000 ships set sail that morning, fanning out. Minesweepers fanned out ahead of them to clear the path. At 6:30 a.m., assault crafts were released. Soon, the crafts hit the beaches and soldiers stormed out. The previous night, Allied paratroopers attacked behind enemy lines, and aerial bombardments were carried out to clear the coasts. However, this hadn't been very successful because of the weather and low visibility. The 5 assaults ranged from very successful at Utah Beach to the most disastrous one at Omaha. Upon landing, soldiers at Utah realized that they had landed miles off their intended location. However, their major, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., had correctly deduced that the current location was a better starting point for the assault than the one that was originally intended for them. They went ahead with the assault, and Omaha was among the first of the 5 beaches to be overrun by the Allies. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroics. Omaha Beach, though, was a different story completely. Some landing crafts took water due to the storm, and men had to swim their way to the shore. When they finally made it to the shore, they were sick, tired, and disorganized. They were bombarded by German infantry, and there were massive casualties. Retreat was considered, but that would have been a major strategic disaster because Omaha Beach was the point of linkage between the American and the British forces. The beach wasn't completely overrun by the end of the day, even though the troops were able to gain a higher ground and attack the German positions with some help from the Navy. This was the bloodiest of the 5 landings. At the end of the first day, the assault was considered a failure. Only Juno and Gold were linked on the first day, and all the 5 beaches wouldn't be linked till 12th of July. The assault went on till mid July and led to an eventual Allied victory over the Axis powers. The Normandy landings were the largest seaborne invasion in history. German casualties on D Day go up to 4,000 to 9,000 men. Allied casualties are estimated around 10,000. The Allied forces may have never won the war if it wasn't for the choices made on this day or the days leading up to this. Our days would have been very different if D-Day had never taken place. These events are immortalized in our pop culture, in our movies, in our books, and in our video games, and that adds a sense of fictitiousness to it. But it's very important to realize that these were real events and the human cost of it was very real.
The Battle of Waterloo. Arthur Wellesley once famously said, and I quote, "The Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. For 10 years, one man had dominated Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. Under his military genius, France conquered an empire that spanned the continent. But as they say, a lone warrior can only last for so long. He was eventually defeated by a grand coalition of his enemies, none of which would have probably been able to defeat him on their own. The Battle of Waterloo was fought between the French army under the command of the great Napoleon Bonaparte and the British-led coalition under the command of Duke Wellington. This ill-fated day for Bonaparte on 18 June 1815 marked the end of the Hundred Days. It also meant the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which was the end of his legacy. In 1812, Napoleon led a disastrous invasion of Russia, in which his army was forced to retreat and suffered massive casualties. At the same time, the Spanish and Portuguese, with assistance from the British, drove Napoleon's forces from the Iberian Peninsula in the Peninsular War. In the 1813 Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, Napoleon's army was defeated by a coalition that included Austrian, Russian, Swedish, and Prussian troops. Afterwards, Napoleon retreated to France, where in March 1814, coalition forces captured Paris. 10 months later, in February 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba and sailed to the French mainland with a group of more than 1,000 supporters. A month later, he returned to Paris, where he was welcomed by cheering crowds. Meanwhile, a week back at the Congress of Vienna, his enemies are locked in an intense dispute about the future of Europe. They declared Napoleon an outlaw. 4 days later, armies from UK, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were mobilized to defeat the French army under Bonaparte. The new king, Louis XVIII, fled, and Napoleon embarked on what came to be known as his Hundred Days Campaign. In June 1815, Napoleon's forces marched into Belgium, where separate armies of British and Prussian troops were camped. At the Battle of Ligny on June 16, Napoleon defeated the Prussians under the command of Gebhard Lebert von Blücher. However, the French were unable to totally destroy the Prussian army. 2 days later, on June 18, Napoleon led his army of some 72,000 troops against the 68,000-man British army, which had taken up a position south of Brussels near the village of Waterloo. The British army, which included Belgian, Dutch, and German troops, was commanded by Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, who had gained prominence fighting against the French during the Peninsular War. In a critical blunder, Napoleon waited until midday to give the command to attack in order to let the waterlogged ground dry after the previous night's rainstorm. The delay gave Blücher's remaining troops time to march to Waterloo and join the battle later that day. Although Napoleon's troops mounted a strong attack against the British, the arrival of the Prussians turned the tide against the French. The French Emperor's outnumbered army retreated in chaos. Reportedly fatigued and in poor health during the Belgian campaign, Napoleon committed tactical errors and acted indecisively. He was also blamed for appointing inadequate commanders. He reportedly rode away from the battle in tears. A month later, on June 22nd, Napoleon was once again abdicated. A couple of months later, in October, he was exiled to the remote British-held island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he died 5 years later at the age of 51. The end of the war, and subsequently Bonaparte's life, was not justice to the legacy he had created for himself.
Hello, people. I'm here to talk about China. Well, that was pure cringe. But really, I'm here to talk about the hypocrisy of war. In simpler words, it's just excuses employed to gain more profit. The same country that started the war on drugs also took part in the war for drugs. Pretty ironic, isn't it? Of course, I'm talking about the Opium Wars. Let's paint a picture here. It's 1792. Britain has lost its most important colony, USA, and it is in love with Chinese goods like porcelain, silk, and tea, especially tea. So much that its economy depends on it. To be precise, a tenth of British revenue was direct from tea trade. But there was a problem here. The Chinese were pretty restrictive in trade and accepted silver only. Their general disinterest in British goods ran the trade deficit as far as 18 million pounds. After much sophisticated thought, after much deliberation, the British found a solution for this deficit: growing drugs, namely opium, and, you guessed it, in India. A quick bonus point for Mumbaikars. This dude here is Jamsetji JJ Boy. Yeah, the JJ of JJ School of Arts and JJ Hospital. He supplied 1/3 of the opium grown in India. Yeah. Furthermore, Indian opium, being more potent, was an instant hit. And the smuggling of opium grew fast, up to 5.6 million pounds. The results were disastrous. 90% of Chinese young males were addicted to it. Even the head of the anti-opium task force, Lin Zexu, sent an open letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience. On getting no reply, he seized and destroyed 1,000 tons of opium from the traders. It was a king's ransom. It was basically 1/6 of UK's military expenditure. The British had it. They weren't going to let history repeat itself. First, the Boston Tea Party, and now this? Nuh-uh. They blockaded Canton, and after the Chinese fleet came forward to protect potential merchants, they went to war. The technological disparity was so high that even in the small scuffle, 15 Chinese men died, whereas only one Brit was wounded. Chinese ships were literally called war junks. Furthermore, ports and territories were swiftly and almost effortlessly captured, with major casualties coming from overheating of their own equipment. At this point, they found something. They found this. This is an opium pipe. Next to cannons in guard towers, addicts ranged from petty cavalry to senior officers. The resistance was weakened by the very drug they were fighting against. Desperation set in for the Chinese. They kept calling and breaking their own truces, and even tried sending out manned fireboats, that is, manned rowboats filled with gunpowder. I couldn't find any pictures of this, but yeah, it was desperate. They went full on kamikaze, but to no avail. When the army reached Nanking, the emperor knew it was better to negotiate rather than surrender. The terms of negotiation came to be known as the Treaty of Nanking. 21 million pounds along with Hong Kong was given to British, but opium still wasn't legalized. Thus began the century of humiliation for the Chinese. The once revered Qing dynasty was revealed to be a paper tiger, but their suffering wasn't over yet. After 2 decades or 20 years, UK demanded more ports, more freedom, and ultimately legalization of opium. UK was literally like, save lives, legalize. To which the emperor refused. All they needed now was an excuse, which they got when the Chinese forces captured a Chinese pirate ship sailing under the British flag. And they yelled, war. This time, however, they pulled out the big guns. They went to France, USA, and Russia. Only France lended military support. The Anglo-French alliance began its attack on Chinese empire late in 1857 because they were busy crushing the first war of independence in India. Their forces breezed through and gained control of the Bohai Sea and the important Taku fort, which protected the mouth of the High River. In typical Russian fashion, Russia threatened war, but settled ultimately for lands. Before and after. Now you know why Russia shares a border with North Korea. The helpless emperor called for negotiations, resulting in the Treaty of Tianjin. On facing fierce resistance from his own government, he went back on his words and, unknown to the retreating British army, he started amping up defenses. Now, when British and French lawmakers were banned from going to Beijing to implement the treaty, they were shelled down by the Chinese. Needless to say, British were pissed. Again, yeah. Massive armies retook all the conquered territories with fierce voracity. The negotiations also broke down when the British envoys' men were killed for disrespecting the Chinese, and the emperor escaped into exile. The Summer Palace, a glorious testament to centuries of Chinese culture, was looted and burned down as retaliation. Later, in the Convention of Peking, the final blow of humiliation was dealt to the Chinese in terms known as the unequal treaties. The Chinese army was 4 times larger than the alliance, and yet they lost. An estimated 69 troops died compared to 20,000 Chinese in the First War itself, ultimately rebranding these wars as massacres. The Chinese learned a valuable lesson that if you are backward, you will take a beating. These lessons shaped the rationale for the Chinese Revolution against imperialism, which eventually is succeeding today. These wars have been seared into the Chinese psyche and often come up when dealings with the West go bad. As we have seen today, war is almost a negative sum game. Both sides always feel that they are fighting for the right cause. People die. Real lives are laid down. As Mr. Miyagi once said, fighting not good, somebody always get hurt. Thank you.